Good morning, class. Happy
Good
New Year.
morning.
Welcome to American Lit 2021. And I emphasize the 21 because we are in the brand new year. I'm glad to see that so many of you appear to have survived the holiday. And here you are in our attendee list. Good to see your names. Hopefully, we'll hear your voices before all is said and done. We are looking forward to a handful of more months of great discussions, Socratic discussions of American classics. And before we get into this one, I want to remind you that we are making a recording of the class that we'll put up inside Google Classroom before the end of the day today. So that if you need to watch it again or review the notes that we're going to take together, those will be available to you in Google Classroom, along with the first of two discussion post assignments. We're going to ask a question of you based on today's discussion and based on the reading. We'd like you to answer it with a post of your own of approximately 200 words, and you'll have a week to do that. And we encourage you also to answer the questions or to respond to posts of your classmates. And then we'll do the whole thing again next week. So you'll have two chances to continue our discussion online. Pretty great. And we're looking forward to it already. Today's work is one that it looks like you have already finished reading, which I'm glad to hear because that is sort of the expectation. But also, there's some good comments going along in the chat box about how this is sort of a difficult work, maybe hard to follow along with, maybe a little confusing. And it's Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, one of the great works of late 19th century American literature, very often assigned in high school lit classes. And I want to, along with Mrs. A, address the various issues related to this book, up to and including the fact that it appears to be confusing, maybe a little hard to follow, and also the question of what the story is really all about. So I'm looking forward to talking about it. Why don't we dive right in? Mrs. A, how would you like to start?
I think I want to start with just a little review of our methodology and our purposes here. In particular, for students that might be joining us mid-year here, one of the main things we're about at Center for Lit is being careful to kind of sit on our hands while we're reading and listen carefully to the author to hear what he has to say so that we don't make mistakes. Um, exactly as when we're having a conversation with someone else. You know, if you're talking while someone is talking to you, you don't hear half of what they're saying. And when you respond, sometimes it's a non sequitur, right? You say something and they're like, what are you talking about? Did you even hear what I just said to you? I think sometimes that happens to us when we're reading. If we're coming to the text with a lot of preconceived notions, or if we're coming to the text and we're not reading carefully enough, we're not listening carefully enough, right? Reading is listening. If we're not doing a good job as listeners, as readers, then we can misunderstand and misconstrue what the author's trying to say to us. And I think this happens a lot with Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. I think students, because of the title of the work, come to the work expecting, both from that title and probably from a cursory reading of things on the internet, to find this as a coming of age story, which of course it is a coming of age story of sorts, in which a young man going off to war starts out scared and somewhere along the way becomes courageous, right? He acquires the moral virtue courage. And I'm not quite sure that's what Stephen Crane was about. I think that the title may have been ironic in its use. So I
Or
want
at
us
least
to,
you could say, what if the title were ironic? Is it
yeah,
possible?
is it
Has an
possible?
author ever written a story and given it an ironic title that actually means the opposite of what it says? It's
So
happened before. Could it have happened this time?
we want to be paying attention to his use of the term, the Red Badge of Courage. We want to pay attention to where that term comes up, symbolically speaking, within the story, what's going on there. We want to follow him in his use of the term courage and try and discover what he means by that. We want to pay really close attention to the elements of story that he's giving us so that we can follow his argument, right? Because when you're writing a work of fiction, it's not an argument like a rhetorical argument or a speech, a political speech. But the author is using a different form of writing, fiction, right? Which also has structure, just like a work of rhetoric would have. in order to communicate some sort of larger universal idea and contribute to a discussion that was going on before him and will be going on after him about whatever that big idea happens to be. If we're going to follow him, we got to pay attention. We got to not assume, right? Okay, so whatever you've read on the internet about the Red Badge of Courage, I want you to dump it at the door. And we're going to pay attention instead to his language and the things that he says. The world that he creates is going to be very important in this, because there are different factors of fiction that authors can use in order to develop their ideas in the story. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and end, right? Every story structurally looks about the same. We've got an exposition, a rising action, a climax, a denouement, a conclusion, right? That is, there's an introductory portion of the story, that exposition, where we meet main characters and they're put in some sort of a situation, a setting of some sort. And sometimes that setting itself provides some sort of initial conflict that gets that story running, right? Because the conflict is the engine of the story. If you don't have a conflict, you don't have a story. So one of the main things we ask here at Center for Lit right at the beginning of any study of literature is, who is the main character, that protagonist? What does he want? That is, what does he lack, or what is he seeking? And why can't he have it? What are the obstacles between him and the thing he's trying to acquire, right? As we chart his quest, if it's a quest story of some sort, we are going to encounter the various problems that hinge on the ideas that the author wants to discuss through story, right? And when we reach the climactic moment, that moment of the story where something has got to give, where there's going to be some sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, some sort of answer to the basic story question that the conflict inspires, right? That answer, the nature of that answer, is going to hinge on the themes, that is the universal ideas of the story. It's going to tell us what the author has to say about that theme, not just what it is categorically speaking, but his own contribution to a discussion of that theme. All right. If we miss that, then as the story unravels and reaches its conclusion, we're going to get a second chance to hear the author, because the conclusion ends up being the author's last opportunity to state his case, basically. So he's going to point you back in the direction of his thematic content in the last pages of the story. Okay, so that's a quick review of a kind of structural analysis of literature, which is the thing that we're teaching here. The other thing that makes Center for Lit unique is that we don't spend a lot of time on reading comprehension questions here. Instead, we really want to take our time in asking thoughtful discussion questions, right, that get at the heart of these major contributors to the discussions of theme, so that we can track with the author. So we're going to have a lot of dialogue. That is, we hope that you will raise your hand and contribute to our class discussion. We like to think about the story in context as well. And sometimes we save that context for the end of class so that we can sort of check our work and see if we were tracking with the author. It does help, however, to know a little something about your author before you begin to read, because no author writes in a vacuum. He's born into a time and place, and their ideas, kind of cross currents of ideas, right, shaping his own experience in the world and his experience with those universals that we keep talking about, those ideas that we keep going on about that are at the heart of every story. So I'd sort of like to start there with Crane, maybe particularly because he is so often misunderstood. So when did Stephen Crane live? Who was he? Well, he was an American author, of course, because you're in an American Lit class, so we could check that one off the list, right? But he was born 1871. He died in 1900. He died a very young man. What does that make him? About 28 years old? A short life, but prolific. He wrote so many works of fiction and nonfiction as well that are remembered today. Of course, The Red Badge of Courage being the most famous. He was the last of 14 children, and his dad died when he was 9 years old. His father was a Methodist minister. He spent a lot of time in the urban community, in slums, and was observing the people that he rubbed shoulders with there, and that contributed to his writing. His style was realism. He wrote much like a journalist would write. In this story in particular, did you guys notice the point of view from which he wrote in Red Badge of Courage? Who noticed? And feel free to raise your hands. Yeah, it's third person. What kind of third person treatment did he give it? Is it a limited narrative view or an omniscient narrative? Yes, third person omniscient. And what does that do for him? What kind of a tone does that create in the story? Why would one choose the third person omniscient?
Emerson says someone who knows what everyone's thinking so they can get into the character's mind.
Okay, he knows everything.
I like Sophie's comment.
Sophie's comment. Yeah, very external. Can you tell us about that? What do you mean it's very external? You're right. Maybe you could raise your hand and talk to us about that a little bit.
Ava says he sees beyond external appearances to see what really happens and why.
Okay.
If the narrator is external, the reader then is external too, right?
Yes.
And it's not so much that the reader is inside everybody's head, although he is. It's that the reader is observing everything, almost like a scientist observing something in a microscope.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. I'm glad you said that. It's like a scientific observation. By the way, does he comment much about what he thinks as the narrator about what he's observing? No, he really doesn't, does he? He's just reporting. He's telling what he sees and what the person thinks and what the person does, what the characters are doing, right? But he's not giving you any kind of moral judgment on that.
Fatima says it's kind of insensitive in a way.
Okay, yeah, you could say that. I like clinical. It's a little clinical in its treatment. All right, what about the subject matter? What kind of subject matters was he interested in? Well, I already told you he was interested in writing about things in the that he saw going on in the inner city, right? But also, he's interested in this issue of war, how men act under pressure, right? And everything he wrote about, whether it was the war or prostitution, he wrote about prostitution, baggy girl of the streets. He wrote about shipwrecks, the open boat, all kinds of things like that. But in every instance, what he was really interested in was looking at how men behave when they're under pressure. Yeah, it's a very psychological book. That's right, Isaac. It's an analysis. Yeah, it is. It's an analysis. It's a dramatized analysis of what? Of the human condition, right? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a human being? How do human beings act? What makes them tick?
Yeah, good, Aiden. Right? He puts his characters in difficult positions to see how they react.
Kind of like scientists.
Yeah,
right?
Like scientists with mice, right?
Yep. Okay. Okay. So what about his school of thought? He was a realist. What does that mean, Mr. A? What's a realist?
Well, a realist is an author in the American tradition writing in the last half of the 19th century who is influenced by other authors who have some of the same artistic and literary concerns. And those concerns are to describe the life that they witness as accurately as possible, using language that is direct in its explanation of what they see. So the overarching artistic commitment of a realist author is to tell it like he sees it. And so realist authors, and this is a group of authors in the late 19th century that sort of begins with Mark Twain and goes right down through Stephen Crane and Jack London, they are committed to describing in accurate dialect, in accurate description, the world around them.
Mm-hmm. In addition to being a realist, he was also a naturalist. And what can that tell us about him and his concerns?
Well, so naturalism is a school of literary theory and artistic theory that is sort of a subset of realism. Naturalists hew to all the same principles of description of nature that realists do, but they're also animated by an additional concern, which is to depict not just the human world, but to depict the human world as the product of natural forces.
Thus natural.
Yeah, right? They're interested in nature and its laws and its customs as the driving force behind human society.
So in particular, they believed that your heredity and the place that you were born, your social environment, the things like that determined who you would be,
Yeah.
what your character would be like.
Yeah. So naturalists are influenced, because this is the late 19th century, influenced by the works of Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, which is very, very popular for the very first time during this period.
Mhm.
Very influenced by Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, and in particular, the idea that everything you do is a direct natural physical result of what has happened before. The shape of your body and the shape of your mind have evolved from lower life forms, right? And it is determined what you will do by the forces of nature.
By DNA.
Yeah. And so natural forces are the driving forces for the naturalist. And the way that this works itself out in the human world, the world of thought and feeling and emotion and human relationships, posed a lot of problems for naturalists, or was at least an area where they were very interested in exploring. And so Crane, first of all, belongs to the realist camp. And then secondly, he also belongs to the naturalist camp. So he wants to describe everything exactly like he sees it, with the underlying assumption that natural forces are the things that really determine what goes on.
Yeah, I mean, you can't understate the splash that Darwin's Origin of the Species made in 1859 when it was published, and the ramifications that it had psychologically on these thinkers and writers was tremendous. You can really see it in Crane, especially in this particular, but really in all of his work. He actually took the ideas that you're describing, Mr. A, and he used it as a motivation in character development. He thought about the ideas inherent in Darwinism and in this kind of determinism that you keep discussing. And he, in an experiment, right? Again, with the scientific experiment, he used the novel as like a laboratory for scientific experiment and put men in different positions to see how their nature, their natural makeup, would cause them to behave in particular circumstances. This was kind of the beginning of the scientific novel in that regard.
I need to jump in real quick here, Mrs. A, because a comment has just come down the chat box I think is related to this discussion directly, and I don't know if you noticed it. Cassidy asks, does the youth have a name? And somebody says, well, his name is Henry Fleming. And Cassidy says, well, I didn't catch that for some reason. And I think it's really interesting because you weren't supposed to catch it. Crane does give his character a name, but more often than not, he calls him the youth, leaves his name out of the consideration. And that is actually intentional on Crane's part to underscore what we've been talking about, that Henry Fleming is at the most basic level the object of an experiment. He's at the most basic level, has a lot in common with an experimental mouse that doesn't have a name.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Cassidy, I think the fact that you didn't catch his name is Crane's point. He's doing that on purpose, is what I'm trying to say. Mrs. A, please proceed.
Okay. Well, I'm just sitting here thinking. I don't want to comment too much on this before we've actually gotten into the story. And mostly what I want to do is tip you off that there might be something going on in this story that you've not seen before, so that you don't make assumptions about his ideas that run at cross purposes with what this experimental scientific novel actually is attempting. So I think that might be enough of a nod at it. I want to save enough time at the end, Mr. A, to come back to these ideas and revisit them after we've looked at the novel itself. So can you please set a timer?
I will.
So that we have maybe 15 minutes at the end of class to come back to this.
I will, and I will be brutal.
Please be brutal
at dropping the hammer on time.
Yeah.
So don't take it personal.
Okay, so remember though, what are we going to be thinking about when we come back to this at the end? We should be able to answer the question, what is he saying about human nature? What is a man? What motivates a man, right? What about the issues of humanity. That is things like virtue, things like courage, right? In the world that he creates in the story, is there any such thing as virtue? Is there any such thing as courage? And if so, let's define it. What is it? What is it? Is it in line with traditional ideas of courage, or is he redefining courage? Why would one do such a thing, right? Okay, these are the kinds of questions that we're going to be looking to ask. But as it is, let's start here at the beginning, because that's where he starts. Who is the story about? You've told us it's about Henry Fleming. Describe him at the outset of the story. Who is Henry Fleming?
Hannah, your hand is up. Go ahead, Hannah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's kind of like a romantic, like he's always thinking about the Greeks and his idea of courage, and he's always imagining himself at the head of these charges and being courageous, but he's always doubting himself and he's not sure if he would actually be courageous.
Uh-huh. That's
Okay.
right. Good.
Yeah. So he's a young man who's getting ready to go into his first battle. And he's got all these heroic ideas, these grand ideas of what battles are like and what he should be like, what a warrior should be like in battle. And let's just take a look at that passage you alluded to. It's chapter 1, page 7 in my copy. He had, of course, dreamt of battles all his life, of vague and bloody conflicts that had thrilled him with their sweep and fire. In visions, he had seen himself in many struggles. He had imagined people secure in the shadow of his eagle-eyed prowess. But awake, he had regarded battles as crimson blotches on the pages of the past. He had put them as things of the bygone, with his thought images of heavy crowns and high castles. There was a portion of the world's history which he had regarded as the time of wars, but it, he thought, had been long gone over the horizon and had disappeared forever. From his home, his youthful eyes had looked upon the war in his own country with distrust. It must be some sort of a play affair. He had long despaired of witnessing a Greek-like struggle. Such would be no more, he had said. Men were better or more timid. Secular and religious education had effaced the throat-grappling instinct, or else firm finance held in check the passions. What's he saying here? What's his attitude towards war that he describes? War is dead, yeah, except there's a war going on. By the way, what war is going on? Contribute to our understanding of the setting.
Set during the American Civil War, right?
Which actually Crane himself missed altogether, right? He was born after the Civil War. So he missed the Civil War. He never participated in any of these things that he's depicting, which is amazing because a lot of people who did live through the Civil War said that the way that he described it was exactly right, that the realism was right on point, okay? So he's done an amazing thing here for sure, artistically speaking. All right, but the war is dead. What can he possibly mean since the war was raging at the beginning of the story? There were things that just happened in history. You can't imagine the reality of a gruesome, violent war where humans die. Yes. So war to him is not the actual grittiness of battle, but it's a place where what? Valor occurs, right? It's a place where ideals are writ large.
Like courage.
Over the American scene, right? Good. Okay. All right. What else can you tell me about this youth? Give me some adjectives to describe this kid.
Well,
naive.
Yeah, I was going to say
Very
naive, Aiden. I'm a guy who thinks that war is all about virtue and glory. Obviously hasn't been to one,
Mhm.
right? So he's naive for sure.
Yeah, he's untried. Emerson says he's worried he's going to run away during his first battle. Yeah, absolutely. He's apprehensive.
Oh, Alicia, thoughtful. He is kind of thoughtful, isn't he?
Very thoughtful.
He's kind of self-aware even. He's what he's worried about is his own nature. How will his nature react?
Yeah, Crane
to
says
battle, right?
he suspected himself, right? On page 14, the youth would have liked to have discovered another who suspected himself.
Yeah, proud, introspective, self-examining.
A sympathetic comparison of mental notes would have been a joy to him. So he feels kind of alone, right? And he suspects himself. We know that. What else? In his great anxiety, his heart was continually clamoring at what he considered the intolerable slowness of the generals. Very anxious young man. What else? What else do you see? He's self-conscious. Good. Very self-conscious. A little homesick.
Wants to prove himself.
Yep. What else? Anything else that you find notable? Here's that passage that one of you alluded to earlier, page 11, chapter 1. He perceived now that it did not greatly matter what kind of soldiers he was going to fight, so long as they fought, which fact no one disputed. There was a more serious problem. He lay in his bunk pondering upon it. He tried to mathematically prove to himself that he would not run from a battle. And then later, he was forced to admit that as far as war was concerned, he knew nothing of himself. It's largely untried.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got this naive, idealistic, innocent, right? Who's ignorant of battle and very untried, and who's a little bewildered, a little apprehensive, somewhat full of dread, right? He had the belief that real war was a series of death struggles with small time in between for sleep and meals. But since his regiment had come to the field, the army had done little but sit and try to keep warm. He was brought back then gradually to his old ideas. Greek-like struggles would be no more. Men were better or more timid. Secular and religious education had effaced the throat-grappling instinct, or else firm finances held in check the passions. Hey, didn't we just read this? Oh, he's reiterating it. Always be on the lookout when you see an author say something twice. There's probably a good reason for it. He doesn't want us to miss this. He had grown to regard himself merely as a part of a vast blue demonstration. What does that mean? His province was to look out as far as he could for his personal comfort. For recreation, he could twiddle his thumbs and speculate on the thoughts which must agitate the minds of the generals.
Good comment, Isabella. Henry is only a small piece on a chessboard, or Fatima says he's a part of a bigger cause.
A bigger cause.
The army is a giant blue demonstration, and he is just a piece on that chessboard, or just a cog in that machine, right?
Here, look at this. This is on page 11 also. He was an unknown quantity. He saw that he would again be obliged to experiment as he had in his early youth. He must accumulate information of himself. And meanwhile, he resolved to remain close upon his guard, lest those qualities of which he knew nothing should everlastingly disgrace him. Good Lord, he repeated in dismay. This is interesting. This is sort of an experiment, even for him, right?
He's going to watch his legs and see what they do.
He's going to watch his legs and see what they do. Exactly. Okay. Anything else that you want to say about Henry, Mr. A, before we go on?
We could ask what is it that he wants the most?
What does he want?
Yeah.
Right? What does Henry want?
What does Henry want the most? And you can take your answers from any part of the story. He wants to be a hero. Yeah. And Abby, that's right. He wants to be a wounded hero even, right? The whole title of the book comes from a line where he says he wanted his own wound, his own red badge of courage, right? He also wants safety, Emerson. He wants to survive, doesn't he?
So we're jumping a little ahead. What about what we just read? What does that tell us about what he wanted?
Yeah, Ava, right. Discover himself.
He wants to know who he is. He was an unknown quantity.
Mm-hmm.
He must accumulate information of himself. He's afraid because he's untried. He was forced to admit that as far as the war was concerned, he knew nothing of himself. He wants a little self-knowledge, right? He needs to figure out what kind of stuff he's made of. All right? He wants to withstand. Okay? All right. and he's afraid he's going to run. So he wants to not run. We know that. Okay, we could sum that up and say, from our perspective here, that he wants some sort of courage, right? What do we mean by that word courage when we use it? Somebody define that word as we use it today. To withstand trial and overcome it. Okay, you guys like that? Fatima says some sort of equivalent with manhood. To have fear and act in spite of that fear. Bravery. To be able to stand in the face of hardships without flinching.
Maddie's definition.
I like Ava's definition.
Withstand trial,
That
overcome.
there's something that, about courage, as it's used in the text at least, that has to do with what other people think about you.
Yes, right.
Right?
Reputation.
Reputation is huge. I think reputation might be the largest part of what he means by this, or the reason that he's seeking it. Yeah, Emerson says he wants other people to think that he is courageous in addition to his own want to be courageous. Yeah, he's afraid of being found out in the negative, right? And we can see that in the early pages that we've already read, but that develops as the story goes on, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we're going to want to pay attention to this idea of what others think about him and the way that it drives his actions in the story. Okay, so that's one of the things that he wants. Are there other people in the story that we should pay close attention to? And someone just mentioned Jim Conklin. Aiden, you mentioned Jim Conklin. Who's
And
that?
Aiden's hand is up. Go ahead, Aiden.
Jim Conklin is one of Henry's friends who he likes to talk to, and the youth looks up to Jim Conklin. He sees him as a courageous man and soldier.
Good.
Okay. What do we know about Jim Conklin?
He was the person who, in the first place, started talking about that the battle's gonna start, and
Right.
he dies in the end. He dies of a wound in his hand and in his side, which I think is similar to Jesus Christ, and it even is more similar because of his initials, JC.
Right. Very good. He dies with wounds in his hands and side.
In what way would he be like Christ? If he is indeed supposed to be a Christ figure in the story, then in what way is he acting like a Christ figure?
He leads Henry pretty much in his belief of manhood and guides him through whenever Henry's having trouble, he thinks kind of what would Jim Conklin do.
Okay, so he's a mentor of sorts, and I think it's true that he's a mentor.
An exemplar.
But when we're talking about a Christ figure, we're talking about something more than a mentor, aren't we? Who was Christ? What did he do? We have to understand who Christ was to even understand the term Christ figure, right?
Yeah. Jesus Christ saved all of humanity, and
How?
by forgiving their sins and dying for their sins.
Through a death? Okay.
Sacrifice,
A
yeah.
sacrificial atonement, right?
Good, Aiden.
We know historically that he lived and he collected a variety of disciples. Masses followed him, and he taught them about the kingdom of God, and said that he was eventually going to die and then be risen again. And then that happened. He did die a painful death of execution on the cross as a sinless man who claimed to be the Son of God, and who claimed that through his death and then resurrection, he would redeem all men from their sins. So when we talk about a Christ figure, we're talking about someone who dies to save others in some sort of critical way. So if we're going to talk about Jim Conklin as a Christ figure, I have to know, how does he save others through his death? How does
Jim Conklin save others through his death is the question.
Because I see what you're saying. I see that he is described as with a wound in his side and in his hand. And he does have the initials JC, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a Christ figure. If we're going to make the argument that he's a Christ figure, we have to substantiate that with some sort of legitimate observations about the way that he saves other people through his death.
Ava, your hand is up. Go ahead.
I think the way when he dies, he when Henry is there and sees him die, I think that's that I guess I sparked something inside of Henry that makes him realize something about war and teaches him a lesson.
Okay, let's pay attention to that. Let's track his relationship with this Jim Conklin figure. Let's describe Jim Conklin. Let's see, we hear a lot about his wound and the experience in battle on page 47. I'll look at that in a minute, but initially, he is the tall private, right? The tall private waved his hand. Well, said he profoundly, I thought it might get too hot for Jim Conklin in some of them scrimmages, and if a whole lot of boys started to run and run, why, I suppose I'd start and run. And if I once started to run, I'd run like the devil and no mistake. But if everybody was a standing and a fighting, why, I'd stand and fight. B'Jiminy, I would. I'll bet on it. This is the conversation that the youth has with this soldier about his own feelings about what he might do under pressure in battle. And this soldier, Jim Conklin, says, well, you know, I might run, but if everybody was standing, I might stand. I think I might stand, right? This is our introduction to Jim. And he's been in battle before, right? He's not entirely untried, which is one of the reasons why the youth is interested in his remarks. Okay, well, when we really see Jim in action, it's once the conflict of the story gets underway. It turns up on page 47. Let me tell you what chapter that's in here. It'd be chapter 9. And in order to really discuss this and read this with understanding, we have to know what has happened in the story up until this point. So by the time we get to chapter 9, what's happened in terms of plot in the story? Who can tell us? What happens in the beginning of the story?
Anybody want to raise their hand and summarize action up to this point?
What happens?
The youth runs away from his first battle.
Yeah, the first thing that happens is they engage in a conflict and Henry runs. He ran like a blind man. He began to speed toward the rear in great leaps, right? Directly, it says. His rifle and cap were gone. His unbuttoned coat bulged in the wind. The flap of his cartridge box bobbed wildly, and his canteen, by its slender cord, swung out behind. On his face was all the horror of those things which he imagined. He ran like a blind man. 2 or 3 times he fell down. Once he knocked his shoulder so heavily against a tree that he went headlong. Since he had turned his back upon the fight, his fears had been wondrously magnified. Death about to thrust him between the shoulder blades was far more dreadful than death about to smite him between the eyes. When he thought of it later, he conceived the impression that it's better to view the appalling than to be merely within hearing. The noises of the battle were like stones. He believed himself liable to be crushed. As he ran on, he mingled with others. He dimly saw men on his right and his left, and he heard footsteps behind him. He thought that all the regiment was fleeing, pursued by these ominous clashes. He ran like a blind man. Okay, what happens next? Did everyone run?
Fatima, your hand is up. Go ahead.
So I actually read this like in December. I finished like mid-December. So I was just kind of sitting there just like waiting. And I thought of reading it again, but I was like, no, that probably would be too boring for me because I already read it once. So let me just reflect, let it just sink in. So I did. But I think what happens up until this point, doesn't he end up joining the line of soldiers that are marching that are all injured, and he doesn't necessarily notice that until he falls in line with one of the other soldiers who asks him a bunch of questions, and then he asked him like, why are you here? What did you get injured for? Or how were you injured? And then he gets all flustered and then just kind of like separates himself from that soldier. Um, but that is where we see the term the red badge of courage used, I think. And
Yeah, well, it comes out pretty quickly.
referring-
He discovers initially that they actually were successful in holding back the surge, right? Like his group won in the battle. And what is his response to that discovery? Is he glad?
I actually don't remember. I think
Well, let's read it. It's page 39, chapter 7. The youth cringed as if discovered in a crime. By heavens, they had won after all. The imbecile line had remained and become victors. He could hear cheering. He lifted himself upon his toes and looked in the direction of the fight. A yellow fog lay wallowing on the treetops. From beneath it came the clatter of musketry. Hoarse cries told of an advance. He turned away, amazed and angry. He felt that he had been wronged. He had fled, he told himself, because annihilation approached. He had done a good part in saving himself, who was a little piece of the army. He had considered the time, he said, to be one in which it was the duty of every little piece to rescue itself if possible. Later, the officers could fit the little pieces together again and make a battlefront. If none of the little pieces were wise enough to save themselves from the flurry of death at such a time, why then, where would be the army? It was all plain that he had proceeded according to very correct and commendable rules. His actions had been sagacious things. They'd been full of strategy. They were the work of a master's legs. Thoughts of his comrades came to him. The brittle blue line had withstood the blows and won. He grew bitter over it. It seemed that the blind ignorance and stupidity of those little pieces had betrayed him. He had been overturned and crushed by their lack of sense in holding the position, when intelligent deliberation could have convinced them that it was impossible. He, the enlightened man who looks afar in the dark, had fled because of his superior perceptions and knowledge. He felt a great anger against his comrades. He knew it could be proved that they had been fools. He wondered what they would remark when later he appeared in camp. Well, there that is again, his concern about what others think
His
about him, right?
reputation, yeah.
His mind heard howls of derision. Their density would not enable them to understand his sharper point of view. He began to pity himself acutely. He was ill-used. He was trodden beneath the feet of an iron justice. He had proceeded with wisdom and from the most righteous motives under heaven's blue, only to be frustrated by hateful circumstances. A dull, animal-like rebellion against his fellows, war in the abstract, and fate grew within him. A dull, animal-like rebellion against his fellows, war in the abstract, and fate grew within him. Wow, that one sentence is quite a summary.
I'll say
right?
it is.
He shambled along with bowed head, his brain in a tumult of agony and despair. Notice it didn't say his heart, it said his brain. When he looked loweringly up, quivering at each sound, his eyes had the expression of those of a criminal who thinks his guilt and his punishment great and knows that he can find no words. He went from the fields into a thick woods as if resolved to bury himself. He wished to get out of hearing of the crackling shots, which were to him like voices. Okay, so summarize. Yeah, Alicia, good. He's trying to justify his flight. Emerson says, oh, so he's just acting according to instinct like an animal?
And by the way,
Very good comment.
by the way, at the moment when Henry runs at the end of the previous chapter, Crane doesn't say he runs like a blind man. He says he ran like a rabbit. He too threw down his gun and fled. There was no shame in his face. He ran like a rabbit. So that sort of backs up what you're saying.
Yeah, and
Emerson.
what Emerson says. Yeah,
Yeah.
very good. Very good. Okay, what happens next? After he discovers that they held the line and he feels ill-used, that all of his companions were idiots and they'd just done this to make him look bad, to expose him when he was the one who was sagacious. He was the wise one for taking to his legs to save that little piece of what? Of the army, right? Let them put those pieces back together later. What does he do next? Yeah, he wanders away from the line of injured soldiers, actually. He goes off into the forest, remember? And what happens while he's in the forest?
He has a little encounter. Fatima says, finds the dead man, finds a corpse.
He does. Let's take a look at this. Goes off into the forest. Off was the rumble of death. It seemed now that nature, capital N, by the way, had no ears. Nature had no ears. What does that mean? This landscape gave him assurance, a fair field holding life. It was the religion of peace. It would die if its timid eyes were compelled to see blood. He conceived nature to be a woman with a deep aversion to tragedy. By the way, there's a name for this. It's called the pathetic fallacy, this idea that nature has feelings, and it's basically a projection, right, of human feeling onto nature, a personification of nature, if you will. He threw a pine cone at a jovial squirrel, and he ran with chattering fear. High in a treetop, he stopped and, poking his head cautiously from behind a branch, looked down with an air of trepidation. The youth felt triumphant at this exhibition. There was the law, he said. Nature had given him a sign. The squirrel, immediately upon recognizing danger, had taken to his legs without ado. He did not stand stolidly baring his furry belly to the missile and die with an upward glance at the sympathetic heavens. On the contrary, he'd fled as fast as his legs could carry him. And he was but an ordinary squirrel, too, doubtless no philosopher of his race. The youth wended, feeling that nature was of his mind. She reinforced his argument with proofs that lived where the sun shone. Once he found himself almost into a swamp and was obliged to walk upon bog tufts and watch his feet to keep away from the oily mire. And he continues going until finally he gets into this deep thicket. He walked on, going from obscurity into promises of a greater obscurity. At length, he reached a place where the high arching boughs made a chapel. Okay, now this is interesting, right? This is some religious imagery. He softly pushed the green doors aside and entered. Pine needles were a gentle brown carpet. There was a religious half-light. Near the threshold, he stopped, horror-stricken at the sight of a thing. A thing, not a man, a thing, right? He was being looked at by a dead man who was seated with his back against a column-like tree. The corpse was dressed in a uniform that had once been blue, but was now faded to a melancholy shade of green. The eyes, staring at the youth, had changed to the dull hue to be seen on the side of a dead fish. The mouth was open. Its red had changed to an appalling yellow. Over the gray skin of the face ran little ants. One was trundling some sort of a bundle along the upper lip. The youth gave a shriek as he confronted the thing. He was for moments turned to stone before it. He remained staring into the liquid-looking eyes. The dead man and the living man exchanged a long look. Then the youth cautiously put one hand behind him and brought it against a tree. Leaning upon this, he retreated step by step with his face still toward the thing. He feared that if he turned his back, the body might spring up and stealthily pursue him. The branches pushing against him threatened to throw him over upon it. His unguided feet, too, caught aggravatingly in brambles, and with it all, he received a subtle suggestion to touch the corpse. As he thought of his hand upon it, he shuddered profoundly. At last, he burst the bonds which had fastened him to the spot and fled, unheeding the underbrush. He was pursued by a sight of the black ants swarming greedily upon the gray face and venturing horribly near to the eyes. After a time, he paused and, breathless and panting, listened. He imagined some strange voice would come from the dead throat and squawk after him in horrible menaces. The trees about the portal of the chapel moved soughingly in a soft wind. A sad silence was upon the little guarding edifice. What has happened here? No, Emerson, I don't think it's that religion leads to death. I don't think that's what this is about. He has something like a religious experience, though. What is religion about? What does religion purport to do?
What do you learn about when you go into a chapel?
Eternity?
What do you-
Maybe safety, salvation and life, about the afterlife. How about the nature of life, the nature of man, the nature of
things.
God,
You
the
get an
nature
explanation,
of everything,
right?
right?
Religion is for explaining how it really is.
Explaining the quote unquote eternals, right?
Yes, the universals.
The universals. Okay, so he walks into this natural cathedral, right? And remember, this is not a Christian church, the Cathedral of God. This is very specifically nature's cathedral, right? And he assumes when he goes into this cathedral, before he walks in, moments before he walks in, that nature takes his side, that nature feels what he feels, that nature actually has an alliance with him, feels an affinity to him, right? Cries with him. Does he find this to be true in the Cathedral of Nature? What is nature really like? Sum it up in a word. Okay, death. Nature protects the dead man. Does it though? Because what about those ants? It's kind of horrifying. Why is it horrifying? What does this show him about man? What is a man according to this?
There you go. There's the question. What is a man in the Cathedral of Nature?
Okay, mortal.
Mortal
more than
actually
that,
gives
I
him
think.
too much credit. It's not that he's mortal.
Just a thing.
He's
Good,
just a
Isabella.
hunk of flesh.
Just a thing. He uses the word at least twice in that passage that I read. The thing, the corpse, the thing, right? A part of a bigger cycle. So just a part of nature. Does nature feel for that man? Doesn't appear to, right? That pathetic fallacy exploded in this moment for this young man, right? Not on his side, no. Not sad, no. Actually consuming him. Next, they'll be in his eyes, right? Desecrating. If it's a man, it's a desecration of a body. It's eating him up, decomposing him.
I think the best word to describe it is impersonal.
Very impersonal.
There is nothing personal about it, so that adjectives like cruel don't even apply.
No,
There's no such thing as cruelty when there's
kind
no
of macabre,
personality.
right?
Yeah, so he has a very religious experience. He peers, you might say, into the heart of things in this cathedral.
Nature is indifferent.
What
Good,
he
Ava.
sees is impersonal, brute nature.
Okay, what happens next?
If we're filling in rising action with episodes, what's the next episode?
Yeah, he goes back to the battle and he meets the tattered soldier. Okay, let's read that section. That's page 54 here. Let's see. He fell back into the procession until the tattered soldier was not in sight. But he was amid the wounds. The mob of men was bleeding. How about that line? He really writes well. The mob of men was bleeding collectively.
Everything is designed to suppress this idea of individual personality.
Tell me about this tattered soldier. Who's the tattered soldier? Why is he? Well, what is he to Jim? That's probably the way to ask it. Who is the tattered soldier? Not to Jim, to the youth. Sorry, I didn't say that very well.
No, Ava, Jim is already dead.
No, not yet. Listen,
I'm sorry. Ava asks, is Jim the tattered soldier?
The tattered soldier is,
saying
listen,
no.
let's just read here. The battle was like the grinding of an immense and terrible machine to him. I'm just reading you passages here, okay? He stalked like the specter of a soldier, his eyes burning with power of a stare into the unknown. This is a guy in the line. His lips were curled in hard lines and his teeth were clenched. His hands were bloody from where he pressed them upon his wound. He seemed to be awaiting the moment when he should pitch headlong. He stalked like the specter of a soldier, his eyes burning with the power of a stare into the unknown. The youth joined with this crowd and marched along with it. The torn bodies expressed the awful machinery in which the men had been entangled, like mauled by a machine. By the way, tell me about his description of the army.
It's speaking of impersonal. It's a machine.
It's a machine. There was a tattered man, fouled with dust, blood, and powder stain from hair to shoes, who trudged quietly at the youth's side. He was listening with eagerness and much humility to the lurid descriptions of a bearded sergeant. His lean features wore an expression of awe and admiration. He was like a listener in the country store to wondrous tales told among the sugar barrels. He eyed the storyteller with unspeakable wonder. His mouth was agape in yokel fashion. The sergeant, taking note of this, gave pause to his elaborate history while he administered a sardonic comment. Be careful, honey, you'll be a catching flies, he said. The tattered man shrank back abashed. After a time, he began to sidle next to the youth and in a different way try to make him a friend. His voice was gentle as the girl's voice and his eyes were pleading. The youth saw with surprise that the soldier had two wounds, one in the head, bound with a blood-soaked rag, and the other in the arm, making that member dangle like a broken bough. After they'd walked together for some time, the tattered man mustered sufficient courage to speak. It was a pretty good fight, wasn't it? He said timidly. The youth, deep in thought, glanced up at the bloody and grim figure with its lamb-like eyes. What? It was a pretty good fight, wasn't it? Yes, said the youth shortly. He quickened his pace. But the other hobbled industriously after him. There was an air of apology in his manner, but he evidently thought that he needed only to talk for a time, and the youth would perceive that he was a good fellow. It was a pretty good fight, wasn't it? He began in a small voice, and then he achieved the fortitude to continue. Darn me if I ever see fellers fight so. Laws, how they did fight. I know the boys like that. I know the boys like that when they once got square at it. The boys ain't had no fair chance up to now, but this time they showed what they was. I know it did turn out this way. You can't lick them boys. No, sir. They're fighters, they be. He breathed a deep breath of humble admiration. He had looked at the youth for encouragement several times, received none, but gradually he seemed to get absorbed in his subject. Okay, eventually he asks the youth, where are you hit? Where are you hit, old boy? He asked in a brotherly tone. This is the end of chapter 8. What? He asked. Where are you hit? Repeated the tattered man. Why, began the youth, he turned away suddenly and slid through the crowd. His brow was heavily flushed and his fingers were picking nervously at one of his buttons. He bent his head and fastened his eyes studiously upon the button as if it were a little problem. The tattered man looked after him in astonishment. The youth fell back in the procession until the tattered soldier was not in sight and started to walk with the others, but he was amid wounds. The mob of men was bleeding. Talk to me about that little interlude with the tattered man. Why is it in there? Why did Crane write that in?
Abby says, could he be his conscience?
Well, I don't know that he is his conscience, but he certainly provokes his conscience, doesn't he? He's just another guy that fought in the battle, and he's poking on that sore spot in Henry, right? Henry, does he have a wound? No, he
hasn't been wounded. He's hit on the head with the rifle butt of a fellow soldier at one point. But...
Okay, let's just keep reading chapter 9 here so that we can follow him. The mob of men was bleeding. Because of the tattered soldier's questions, he now felt his shame could be viewed. What's his problem here? Early, his problem is that he's untried. Now, what's his problem? He's ashamed of himself.
He's ashamed of himself.
But it's more than that. He ran, he tried and failed. He failed the test. He doesn't want anyone to find out. Yeah, he doesn't want anyone to know that he ran. What's he most afraid of? Is it that he doesn't have courage?
Is it most
public opinion? Yeah, he's really afraid of public opinion.
Being
whatever
known as a coward.
Yeah. He was continually casting sidelong glances to see if the men were contemplating the letters of guilt he felt burned into his brow. At times, he regarded the wounded soldiers in an envious way. He conceived persons with torn bodies to be peculiarly happy. He wished that he too had a wound, a red badge of courage. Oh, wait a minute. There's our title. What's it mean? What's it stand for? The spectral soldier was at his side like a stalking reproach. The man's eyes were still fixed into a stare into the unknown. His gray, appalling face had attracted attention in the crowd, and men slowing to his jury pace were walking with him. They were discussing his plight, questioning him and giving him advice. In a dogged way, he repelled them, signing to them to go on and leave him alone. The shadows of his face were deepening, and his tight lips seemed holding in check the moan of great despair. There could be seen a certain stiffness in the movements of his body, as if he were taking infinite care not to arouse the passion of his wounds. As he went on, he seemed always looking for a place, like one who goes to choose a grave. Something in the gesture of the man as he waved the bloody and pitying soldiers away made the youth start as if bitten. He yelled in horror, Tottering forward, he laid a quivering hand upon the man's arm, and as the latter slowly turned his wax-like features toward him, the youth screamed, "God, Jim Conklin!" The tall soldier made a little commonplace smile. "Hello, Henry," he said. The youth swayed on his legs and glared strangely and stuttered and stammered, "Oh, Jim, oh, Jim, oh, Jim." The tall soldier held out his gory hand. There was a curious red and black combination of new blood and old blood upon it. "Where you been, Henry?" he asked. He continued in a monotonous voice, "Thought maybe you got keeled over. There's been thunder to pay today. I was worrying about it a good deal." The youth lamented. What comes of his conversation with Jim Conklin?
What
Remember,
comes of it?
Jim
I don't
has,
understand the question.
well, initially he goes to Jim in order to find out what the battle's going to be like and to share his fears of running. And he finds Jim's courage, right, before the battle. Okay, yeah, Jim's death is coming, but first they have a conversation. What's Jim say? He says, "Tell you what I'm afraid of, Henry. I'll tell you what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid I'll fall down, and then, them damned artillery wagons, they'll like as not run me over. That's what I'm afraid of." What's Jim here? An honored, courageous soldier? He's very wounded. Yeah. He witnesses his death. That's true. He's afraid of being run over by what? This is important. He's afraid of being run over by the artillery, right? By his unit, by the machine. Good, Fatima.
The blue demonstration.
Yeah. And what is he to the machine? Just an expendable part. Nothing. Just a cog. Yep, exactly.
A speck.
Okay, so Jim's going to take care of him. "I'll take care of you, Jim. I'll take care of you. I swear to God, I will." "Sure, will you, Henry?" Yes, I tell you, I'll take care of you, Jim." What does he do? Well, eventually, Jim starts running. And then there's a little death dance that he does that's particularly appalling. He lurches, he runs. What happens next? Let's see here. At last, they saw him stop and stand motionless. Hastening up, they perceived that his face wore an expression telling that he had at last found the place for which he'd struggled. His spare figure was erect, his bloody hands quietly at his side. He was waiting with patience for something that he had come to meet. He was at the rendezvous. They paused and stood expectant. There was silence. Finally, the chest of the doomed soldier began to heave with a strained motion. It increased in violence until it was as if an animal was within and was kicking and tumbling furiously to be free. This spectacle of gradual strangulation made the youth writhe, and once as his friend rolled his eyes, he saw something in them that made him sink wailing to the ground. He raised his voice in a last supreme call. "Jim, Jim, Jim!" The tall soldier opened his lips and spoke. He made a gesture. "Leave me be. Don't touch me. Leave me be." There was another silence while he waited, and suddenly his form stiffened and straightened. Then it was shaken by a prolonged ague. He stared into space. To the two watchers, there was a curious and profound dignity in the firm lines of his awful face. He was invaded by a creeping strangeness that slowly enveloped him. For a moment, the tremor of his legs caused him to dance a sort of hideous hornpipe. His arms beat wildly about his head in an expression of imp-like enthusiasm. His tall figure stretched itself to its full height. There was a slight rending sound. Then it began to swing forward, slow and straight, in the manner of a falling tree. A swift muscular contortion made the left shoulder strike the ground first. The body seemed to bounce a little way from the earth. "God," said the tattered soldier. The youth had watched spellbound this ceremony at the place of meeting. His face had been twisted into an expression of every agony he'd imagined for his friend. He now sprang to his feet and, going closer, gazed upon the paste-like face. The mouth was open and the teeth showed in a laugh. As the flap of the blue jacket fell away from the body, he could see that the side looked as if it had been chewed by wolves. The youth turned with sudden livid rage toward the battlefield and shook his fist. He seemed about to deliver a philippic. Hell! The red sun was pasted in the sky like what? Like a wafer. Oh, more religious imagery. What's that?
Communion wafer.
Like a communion wafer. But pasted up in the sky like a communion wafer. All right. What does this do to the youth? And by the way, the tattered man is standing there as well, watching this whole thing go down. It hurts him. Okay. He's appalled. Makes him mad. Who's he mad at? More? Death? The world? Okay. Everyone and everything? God, really? Okay, maybe God. And what's with the depiction of the sun like a funeral wafer pasted up into the sky?
Communion wafer, not funeral.
That's not, I'm sorry, I said the wrong, a communion wafer. What's with the religious imagery? What are we to make of this? It's constructed. He writes it very intentionally. He uses this language on purpose. It's really similar to what the kind of language that Crane used in that other scene we read in the natural chapel, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a dying for his country kind of thing. I'm not so sure that it's a Christ-like figure of Jim. Although, if we're going to consider him a sacrifice, what was he sacrificed to? What was he sacrificed for? What did his death accomplish?
I think it's important to notice that in terms of earthly things, at least, Jim Conklin's death accomplishes exactly nothing.
Nothing at all.
Because he's a tiny piece, as Emerson says, of that blue demonstration.
The death seems worthless. Yeah. Yep. You can see that he's really interested in painting reality against the backdrop of idealism, right? So he wants, by the way, how does that use of religious language and imagery affect the tone of that scene?
Well, I think it's sarcastic.
I think so too.
I think it's sarcastic.
The juxtaposition of those two things calls in question the one because of the nature of the other, does it not?
Yeah.
And I think that's his game here, right? He's a realist after all. And so he's confronting the ideal with the real perpetually in this scientific novel, right? So ideally, when a man comes into battle, he goes for glory and for fame, right? And he's fighting for the ideals like a virtuous soldier. But in reality, he takes to his legs and runs like a rabbit, right? Ideally, nature feels with man. It has man's heart, and the rain is like tears. But in reality, it's very impersonal, and it doesn't even know that you're there, and it just does its thing, devouring you.
Ideally, a noble sacrificial death would result in salvation, deliverance, life in some other sphere. In reality, it's just a guy bleeding out on his feet and then falling down.
And the idea, if this is Christ imagery, it's used ironically, right? Because that red sun is pasted in the sky like a communion wafer. It's just pasted up there. The whole idea of religion is just pasted on.
It's just pasted on.
Okay.
So
what happens with the tattered man next?
Well, first of all, the chat box is blowing up with goodness gracious, what a depressing book.
Yeah, right? Yeah, we give this to our kids. Why? To inspire the virtue of courage. There's a big question mark after that one for me here. So the tattered man stood musing. Well, he was a regular Jim Dandy for nerve, wasn't he? A regular Jim Dandy. I wonder where he is got his strength from. Never seen a man do like that before. It was a funny thing. Well, he was a regular Jim Dandy. How does this whole experience affect the youth? And tell me about his continued conversation with the tattered man. They get back to his the issue of his wound. You look pretty peaked yourself. Where's urine located? The youth had been wriggling since the introduction of this topic. He now gave a cry of exasperation and made a furious motion with his hand. "Oh, don't bother me," he said. He was enraged against the tattered man and could have strangled him. His companions seemed ever to play intolerable parts. They were ever upraising the ghost of shame on the stick of their curiosity. He turned toward the tattered man as one at bay. Ooh, that's an interesting line. He turned toward the tattered man as one at bay.
Who's at bay? What does that phrase mean in general?
Like a hound?
Yeah, like something being chased by a
cornered
hound.
hound, right? Yeah, like a cornered animal.
Yeah, right.
Well, Lord knows I don't want to bother anybody, said the other. I got my own to tend to. Okay,
So-
what happens next?
Well, I would suggest a quick summary of a couple of things next, unless Mrs. A, you had it
No,
in
you
mind to
please
go
go
through in
ahead.
detail. So he comes back to the camp, and then the issue with the tattered man has brought up the fact that he doesn't really have a wound, that it's necessary to dissemble.
Well, what
Right?
happens? Something happens that's a stroke of luck for him, really. It pushes the progress of the story forward, of the plot. What happens next?
He gets bopped on the head with a rifle.
Yeah.
So
Yep,
he actually gets an injury.
he does, but not the way that people think.
No, not the way that people think. And so that's what I meant by he's forced to dissemble.
The youth began to imagine that he got into the center of the tremendous quarrel and he could perceive no way out of it. From the mouths of the fleeing men came 1,000 wild questions, but no one made answers. The youth, after rushing about and throwing interrogations at the heedless bands of retreating infantry, finally clutched a man by the arm, and they swung around face to face. Why, stammered the youth, struggling with his balking tongue. The man screamed, let me go, let me go. His face was livid and his eyes were rolling uncontrolled. He was heaving and panting. He still grasped his rifle, perhaps having forgotten to release his hold upon it. He tugged frantically, and the youth, being compelled to lean forward, was dragged several paces. Let me go! Let me go! Why? Stuttered the youth. Well, then, bawled the man in a lurid rage. He adroitly and fiercely swung his rifle, and it crushed upon the youth's head. The man ran on. Oh, wow, that's a providential loophole. If I can use the word providential, and probably I shouldn't.
I think you shouldn't.
The youth sees in battle that there's no courage to be found in war, so he leaves. He believes he wants to die, but he sees the insignificance of Jim's death, and he thinks that he wants a wound, and he gets a wound, but that doesn't help. So in the end, he goes back to the war. Okay, but before he goes back to the war, because there's another battle coming, right? And we know he hasn't seen his last action. What happens after he gets hit on the head? What's he do next? This is an important episode. He goes back to camp. How's he greeted? Yeah. They think a bullet might have scraped the top of his head. They misinterpret the situation. He gets taken care of. They're very kind to him. The cheery soldier helps him out, right? And then there's this guy, Wilson. Who's Wilson?
Fatima, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question. When did that scene where he's in the forest and he's just kind of like flailing around because he's wounded and he has no water and food and stuff, and then this other soldier comes and he kind of guides him back to camp or something. That part was really powerful, but I kind of forgot where it happened.
Well, this is in chapter 12.
Okay.
Last he heard a cheery voice near his shoulder. You seem to be in a pretty bad way, boy. The youth didn't look up. The owner of the cheery voice took him firmly by the arm. Well, he said with a round laugh, I'm going your way. The whole gang's going your way, and I guess I can give you a lift. And they began to walk like a drunken man and his friend, right? And he talks to him, and this is the cheery man, takes him back to his camp. Well, there's where your regiment is, and now goodbye, old boy. Good luck to you.
That happens before he gets into the altercation with the guy with the rifle and gets his wound.
No, that's right after.
So
It's right after he gets his wound.
And that's how he gets to camp, right?
Yep, that's how he gets back to camp.
Oh, I see what
after
you're
he's
talking
hit
about.
on the
Got
head.
it.
So chapter 13, then he's back in his camp and he's confronted by Wilson. Halt! He stood tottering before the rifle barrel and called it, why, hello, Wilson, you here? Remember who Wilson is? We met him in the first chapter. He's a loud soldier, right, Jasmine? Right? What was his attitude in the first chapter? You guys remember? Real arrogant, boastful. He's going to go out there and strike a blow for the army, right? Boisterous, hot-headed, all that sort of thing. How about now? How is he in chapter 13?
Humbled.
Is that you,
everybody says.
Henry?
Oh, Aiden, your hand is up. Go ahead.
So Wilson, in the first place, is the arrogant soldier who thinks he can go fight the whole army all by himself. But after the battle, he's very humbled and he isn't serious about it, as serious about himself anymore. He realizes that he's not as much of a big piece of the war as just a small piece in the whole scheme of things.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's right. This
good.
is chapter 14 now. The youth took note of a remarkable change in his comrade. He seemed no more to be continually regarding the proportions of his personal prowess. He was not furious at small words that pricked his conceits. He was no more a loud young soldier. There was about him now a fine reliance. He showed a quiet belief in his purposes and his abilities, and this inward confidence evidently enabled him to be indifferent to little words of the other men aimed at him. The youth reflected. He'd been used to regarding his comrade as a blatant child with an audacity grown from his inexperience, thoughtless, headstrong, jealous, and filled with a tinsel courage, a swaggering babe accustomed to strut in his own dooryard. The youth wondered where had been born these new eyes. When his comrade had made the great discovery that there were many men who would refuse to be subjected by him, apparently the other had now climbed a peak of wisdom from which he could perceive himself as a very wee thing. And the youth saw that ever after it would be easier to live in his friend's neighborhood. Interesting that there's a new humility as a result of the reality of the battle that he experienced. It really does affect this guy differently than it has affected the youth, doesn't it?
Yeah, it seems like it.
It has had a different effect on him. All right, what happens next?
Well, the next thing that I would draw our attention to is the next battle where Henry has a chance to quote unquote fight like a wildcat.
Yeah, I don't want to leave this guy, and I know you want to get on him. We should.
I'm just trying to help.
I know you are, and we're going to get onto that in just a minute. But before
You
we
take your
leave
time.
Wilson, I just want to remember what comes up again at the beginning of chapter 15. The regiment was standing at order arms at the side of the lane, waiting for the command to march, when suddenly the youth remembered the little packet enwrapped in a faded yellow envelope, which the loud young soldier with lugubrious words had entrusted to him. Who can remind me what this little yellow packet is? This is the packet that this loud young soldier gave to Henry just before that previous battle, right? What was that?
Isaac, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
So the lad soldier was convinced that he was going to die in the battle, and so gave Henry that packet because he thought Henry was going to live, and he wanted him to have that packet, I think, to give to his family.
That's
Okay,
Can't
right.
quite
good.
remember.
Yeah, you're exactly,
exactly
right
right.
about that. Okay, so what does this mean to Henry now?
What do you think, Isaac?
How does the discovery of this yellow packet in his breast pocket affect Henry?
It seems to encourage him that he's not the only one who was scared during the battle.
At least that.
Okay, maybe. Is there any other function of the yellow packet on Henry? Oh yeah, Fatima says in the chat box, it's kind of like the youth has some sort of leverage now. Yeah, tell me about that. What do you mean leverage? What's going on here? He starts to tell him he's found it, but he decides not to. Oh, nothing. He resolved not to deal the little blow. It was sufficient that the fact made him glad. It was not necessary to knock his friend on the head with the misguided packet. He'd been possessed of much fear of his friend, for he saw how easily questionings could make holes in his feelings. Okay, what was the situation between him, Henry, and his friend Wilson when he came back to camp? Well, we just observed it. What happened there? He comes back to camp with a fake wound, basically, and says that he's been shot. And then Wilson is going to tend to that wound. And so Wilson, really, if he discovered the true situation, could expose Henry. And so he represents in all his kindness to Henry a threat.
Serious threat.
Right? But now he's found that packet, and he's encouraged. Why? Because it makes him remember that somebody else also felt fear. I don't think so. It's because he's got something on him.
Yeah, you
right?
can blackmail
He
him.
could blackmail him.
Yeah.
He's going to hold it, right? He now rejoiced in the possession of a small weapon with which he could prostrate his comrade at the first signs of a cross-examination. He was master. It would now be he who could laugh and shoot the shafts of derision. He adopted toward him an air of patronizing good humor. His self-pride was now entirely restored. He had performed his mistakes in the dark, so he was still a man.
So Clayton says he's a jerk, and I just want to. I think it's an honest comment, and it looks like he's a jerk, except in this world that Crane is creating, he's suggesting that there are no such things as jerks. They're just big rabbits and little rabbits.
Notice how this
Right?
pops him up. It restores his self-pride. He realizes that he did not shrink from an encounter with the eyes of judges and allowed no thoughts of his own to keep him from an attitude of manfulness. He had performed his mistakes in the dark, so he was still a man. Indeed, when he remembered his fortunes of yesterday and looked at them from a distance, he began to see something fine there. He had license to be pompous and veteran-like. His panting agonies of the past he put out of his sight. In the present, he declared to himself that it was only the doomed and the damned who roared with sincerity at circumstance. Few but they ever did it. A man with a full stomach and the respect of his fellows had no business to scold about anything that he might think to be wrong in the ways of the universe or even with the ways of society. Let the unfortunates rail. The others may play marbles. He did not give a good deal of thought to these battles that lay directly before him. It was not essential that he should plan his ways in regard to them. He had been taught that many obligations of a life were easily avoided. The lessons of yesterday had been that retribution was a laggard and blind. Let's read that again. The lessons of yesterday had been that retribution was a laggard and blind. With these facts before him, he did not deem it necessary that he should become feverish over the possibilities of the ensuing 24 hours. He could leave much to chance. Besides, a faith in himself had secretly blossomed. There was a little flower of confidence growing within him. He was now a man of experience. He'd been out among the dragons, he said, and he had assured himself that they were not so hideous as he had imagined them. Also, they were inaccurate. They did not sting with precision. A stout heart often defied and defying escaped. And furthermore, how could they kill him, who was the chosen of gods and doomed to greatness? He remembered how some of the men had run from battle. Isn't that interesting? How some of the men had run from battle. As he recalled their terror-struck faces, he felt a scorn for them. They had surely been more fleet and more wild than was absolutely necessary. They were weak mortals. As for himself, he had fled with discretion and dignity. A little later, he reflected with condescending pity. This is his experience in the battle and everything that comes after it is really different than the experience that Wilson had. Wilson's response to it was a little bit of self-sight that brought humility, but what about the youth? Totally the opposite, right? He dismisses his own failure and damns his fellows for theirs. He figures as long as he's done these things in the dark, then nobody knows. None's the wiser, so he's still a man. And he gains confidence from it. He realizes that what? It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Okay, so we see this new battle coming. How does Henry fight in the second battle? Let's talk about this. What happens next? By the way, that whole section I was just reading, Henry's kind of rewriting his history, isn't he? Distancing himself from the cowardice of others who ran like him. Okay, he fights like an animal. Good, Isabella. Tell me about that scene.
Chat box is blowing up with answers to that question, Mrs. A.
Yeah, there's another battle. That's right, Fatima. What happens in that battle? He keeps on fighting even when the battle is over. Feels really good about it.
The overhears part, Emerson, we're going to get to in one moment. That's a very significant little detail. But Mrs. A is looking for just a quick summary of his fighting in this battle.
He was not going to be badgered all his life like a kitten chased by boys, he said. It was not well to drive men into final corners. At those moments, they could all develop teeth and claws.
Right. Fights like a wildcat, Ava. That's right.
Yeah, that's the quote. That's the most important quote. This time, instead of fleeing, he stands and fights. And in the aftermath, some of the men muttered and looked at the youth in awestruck ways, and they now looked upon him as a war devil. You all right, Fleming? Do you feel all right? The incidents had made the youth ponder. It was revealed to him that he had been a barbarian, a beast. He had fought like a pagan who defends his religion. Regarding it, he saw that it was fine, wild, and in some ways easy. He'd been a tremendous figure, no doubt. By this struggle, he'd overcome obstacles which he'd admitted to be mountains. They'd fallen like paper peaks, and he was now what he called a hero. And he had not been aware of the process. He had slept, and awakening found himself a knight. What happened? Does Henry find his courage?
Benjamin, your hand is up. Sorry, I didn't see it. Go ahead, Benjamin.
I just wanted to say, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
loud and clear.
So I just wanted to mention a little part about the battle.
Mm-hmm.
It did say he kind of fought unconsciously,
Yeah.
like he didn't realize his rifle was getting hot,
Yeah.
and, like too hot to hold.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay,
just
so what do you make of that,
noticed
that
it.
it's unconscious? Why does that matter? The
I
chat
don't really
box
know.
is blowing up. Hannah says it's instinct. Fatima says it's mechanical. It's
Yeah.
natural. Yeah.
like a
So
machine
if
part.
it's just mechanical,
Mhm.
if it's just instinct, if it's just natural, can we term it virtue?
Or courage, more specifically.
Or at least the kind of courage that we usually mean when we use the term, right?
What do you think, Benjamin?
No, the whole chat box is blowing up. No.
think so.
What do you think, Benjamin?
I don't think it can.
No.
I don't even know that you can call it bravery, Isaac. It was because bravery has something to do with your mind, right? It's mind over matter. It's a facing of fear, bravery's choice. But the way that he's describing it here, it was merely another natural response to conflict. And if you guys have studied conflict scientifically, what do all animals have? They have this thing called instinct, right? And when they're cornered, they do one of two things. They fight
Right.
or they flee, the fight or flight instinct. And what do we see Henry doing? Well, in the first battle, he flees. In the second battle, he fights. And what's the difference between the two?
Not much.
It's not a dime's worth of difference. The only thing that's different is the response of the other animals around him, right? It's the response, it's public opinion. That's the only response. So what makes a man, according to Crane here? Is it bravery? Is it courage? Public opinion.
Public opinion.
That's right. It's public opinion. Does it have anything to do with virtue? Honor? Not so much. Doing something really noble? Well, let's talk about that. What happens next? Well, there's another battle, but not until he overhears his superiors talking about what he's just done. And what is their attitude about him and about the things that just happened in this battle? His education continues. If this is the education of a man, then he's learning. He learns in that natural cathedral. He learns watching Jim Conklin die. Now he learns from his own secondary responses, his second natural impulse. And now he's learning from what they say about him. And he and all of his companions are called mule drivers.
Let me read this section. This is
Or
Henry,
mules. Yeah, go ahead and read it, please.
Henry overhearing some officers. The two infantrymen could hear nothing until finally he asked, "What troops can you spare?" The officer, who rode like a cowboy, reflected for an instant. "Well," he said, "I had to order in the 12th to help the 76th, and I haven't really got any. But there's the 304th. They fight like a lot of mule drivers. I can spare them best of any." The youth and his friend exchanged glances of astonishment. The general spoke sharply. "Get 'em ready then. I'll watch developments from here and send you word when to start 'em. It'll happen in 5 minutes." As the other officer tossed his fingers toward his cap and, wheeling his horse, started away, the general called out to him in a sober voice, "I don't believe many of your mule drivers will get back." The other shouted something in reply. He smiled. With scared faces, the youth and his companion hurried back to the line.
Can you keep going just a
I
little
was
further?
about to.
Yeah.
These happenings had occupied an incredibly short time, yet the youth felt that in them he had been made aged. New eyes were given to him. And the most startling thing was to learn suddenly that he was very insignificant. The officer spoke of the regiment as if he referred to a broom. Some part of the woods needed sweeping, perhaps, and he merely indicated a broom in a tone properly indifferent to its fate. It was war, no doubt, but it appeared strange.
So how's this affect Henry?
Fatima, he realizes that the soldiers are part of a machine, that they were nothing. It wouldn't matter if they died, that they're animals. But what happens in, what's the effect on Henry personally?
The youth, turning, shot a quick, inquiring glance at his friend. The latter returned to him the same manner of look. They were the only ones who possessed an inner knowledge. That is, they're the only ones that overheard this conversation, right? Mule drivers, hell to pay, don't believe many will get back. It was an ironical secret. Still, they saw no hesitation in each other's faces, and they nodded a mute and unprotesting assent when a shaggy man near them said in a meek voice, "We'll get swallowed." What is this knowledge that they come to?
And why does they say Henry was suddenly aged? Clayton says, could this be the climax? I like this moment as the climax.
Well, I would either choose this one or his animalistic effort in the war and his reflections on it. You know, what he comes to realize when he takes his stand.
If this is a coming of age story, this might be the moment when he
I
finally
think
comes of age.
Yeah,
right?
The language is certainly for it
Mhm.
as being the critical moment. They were the only ones that possessed an inner knowledge, the ironical secret. And what was the ironical secret that they possessed?
It's chapter 18, by the way,
Yeah,
Isaac.
yeah.
Yeah. What's the ironical secret? What's the secret?
That they aren't important, that they don't matter, that he is insignificant.
Also, that his fighting has done his reputation no good.
Nope.
I mean, in some quarters, maybe, but not where it matters. He's a part of a machine. Yeah. New eyes are given him to see the answer to his question. What is a man? What is a hero?
A broom.
A man is a broom. Yeah.
What happens next? Let's finish plotting this story here. There's one more battle, isn't there? Can you describe it, summarize it? Because I do want to leave a little moment here at the end to go back to the things we were talking about before we started this.
Doing fairly well on time, my love.
So what happens in this last battle here?
He holds the flag at the front. Very good. Yeah, that's a good summary, right? In this last battle, he becomes the standard bearer and wins through to some sort of martial success by holding the flag, advancing the flag, planting the flag. And there's some sort of, I don't know, moderation in between fleeing like a rabbit and fighting like a wildcat. It seems to be a...
The youth ran like a madman to reach the woods before a bullet could discover him. He ducked his head low like a football player. In his haste, his eyes almost closed, and the scene was a wild blur. Pulsating saliva stood at the corners of his mouth. It was like frothing at the mouth. Within him, as he hurled himself forward, was born a love, a despairing fondness for this flag which was near him. It was a creation of beauty and invulnerability. It was a goddess, radiant, that bended its form with an imperious gesture to him. It was a woman, red and white, hating and loving, that called him with the voice of his hopes. Because no harm could come to it, he endowed it with power. He kept near, as if it could be a saver of lives, and an imploring cry went from his mind. In the mad scramble, he was aware that the color sergeant flinched suddenly as if struck by a bludgeon. He faltered and then became motionless, save for his quivering knees. He made a spring and a clutch at the pole, and at the same instant, his friend grabbed it from the other side. They jerked at it, stout and furious, but the color sergeant was dead, and the corpse would not relinquish its trust. For a moment, there was a grim encounter. The dead man, swinging with bended back, seemed to be obstinately tugging in ludicrous and awful ways for the possession of the flag. It was past in an instant of time. They wrenched the flag furiously from the dead man, and as they turned again, the corpse swayed forward with bowed head. One arm swung high, and the curved hand fell with a heavy protest on the friend's unheeding shoulder. Did you guys hear the irony in that? I know I was reading it really quickly.
You were.
Did you hear the irony? What does he think when he sees the flag and goes for it? Ah, my salvation. Whoever's holding this flag is invulnerable, protected. Right? The lady patriotism will save him. But the color sergeant, what?
Gets killed in the next
Dies
instant.
in the next instant. Yeah. Anything idealistic in this story is
Ironic.
revealed to be only ironic, right?
In a sense, it looks like Henry is fighting to save the glory of the flag, but really, he's fighting for exactly the same reason he was fighting in all the other battles,
To save his own skin.
to save his own skin.
Fight or flight.
And this time, if I could just summarize quickly without reading more passages,
Mhm.
he gets promoted for his trouble, right? This time he actually wins a little martial glory.
By the way, what of the land that he secures in this moment?
I was going to say that next. Yeah. What is the outcome, militarily speaking, of this battle in which he gets promoted? What does the army do next? Anybody know? It's all lost in the next instant. What do you mean, Isaac? How is it lost? Yeah, they get pushed back. They retrace their steps. The army does.
They retreat.
They retreat.
They gain the ground and then they give it back.
So let's, if I could suggest that we go to the last passages of the story where Henry sort of tries to make sense of what has gone down and indulge in a final self-evaluation. Henry's been thinking about himself as a man and what that means pretty consistently this whole time. And he draws some conclusions here at the end. And how would you characterize them? What does he finally say? If we can do this in about 10 minutes, then we'll return to the issues we began the class with and have a final thematic discussion. What does Henry conclude in his own mind about his questions? Any thoughts? I'm thinking about chapter.
You're looking at 20 or 21?
No, 24.
Oh, 24. Okay.
Yeah, I'm helping you.
You're scooting us
I'm
ahead.
scooting you. We're talking about the last. Actually, why don't we go to the very last section of the book itself? The last couple of pages in my edition. For a time, this pursuing recollection of the tattered man took all elation from the youth's veins. He saw his vivid error, and he was afraid that it would stand before him all his life. He took no share in the chatter of his comrades, nor did he look at them or know them, save when he felt sudden suspicion that they were seeing his thoughts and scrutinizing each detail of the scene with the tattered soldier, where he had been in his own mind a lying coward, right? Yet gradually he mustered force to put the sin at a distance. And at last his eyes seemed to open to some new ways. He found that he could look back upon the brass and bombast of his earlier gospels and see them truly. He was gleeful when he discovered that he now despised them.
What were his earlier gospels?
His earlier gospels. What does that
guys
refer
remember
to?
the early pages?
The thing about ancient glory.
What's a gospel? A gospel's the truth, right?
Yeah.
So what was the early truth? The epics, the glory, the whole idea of virtue, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now he despises them. What does that mean? He sees them truly.
He sees them clearly. He sees a deeper truth than those things, right?
With this conviction came a store of assurance.
I wanted to
you want to
read,
read it? Go ahead.
With the conviction came a store of assurance. He felt a quiet manhood, non-assertive, but of sturdy and strong blood. He knew that he would no more quail before his guides wherever they should point. He had been to touch the great death and found that, after all, it was but the great death. He was a man.
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
What is a man?
What is a man? He's found
In
his
this
answer.
Context. Faulty.
Not
I
faulty,
don't know about
because
that.
faulty implies some sort of code, some sort of standard of good and bad that comes from above, from God, maybe. Man is an animal, instinctual.
Yeah. That man is insignificant, that everything that's going on here is insignificant, even to the people that are orchestrating it, that man's just a cog in a large machine, yeah, that he's mechanized, right? That nature doesn't care, that there is no meaning to any of this stuff.
He had been to touch the great death and found that, after all, it was but the great death. What significance to a glorious death is there? Has he learned? What has he learned about the significance of a glorious death?
He simply survived.
There is no
Jasmine says.
significance. It's but the great death.
Let's keep reading here. You go ahead, Mr. A.
Sure.
We just did the last section.
So it came to pass that as he trudged from the place of blood and wrath, his soul changed.
That's interesting. How can he talk about a soul? That might be an inconsistent line with the rest of the story that he's written here. I wonder, what does he mean by that?
He came from hot plowshares to prospects of clover tranquilly, and it was as if hot plowshares were not. Scars faded as flowers. It rained. The procession of weary soldiers became a bedraggled train, despondent and muttering, marching with churning effort in a trough of liquid brown mud under a low, wretched sky. Yet the youth smiled, for he saw that the world was a world for him, though many discovered it to be made of oaths and walking sticks. He had rid himself of the red sickness of battle. What had he done? He'd escaped. He had survived. The sultry nightmare was in the past. He had been an animal, blistered and sweating in the heat and pain of war. He turned now with a lover's thirst to images of tranquil skies, fresh meadows, cool brooks, an existence of soft and eternal peace.
So sort of like a cat, right?
Better weather.
Redolent in the sunshine.
Yeah. Over the river, a golden ray of sun came through the hosts of leaden rain clouds. And why? Why does a golden ray of sun strike through the clouds at this moment? Why?
There's
No
that pathetic fallacy
reason.
again, right?
Absolutely no reason.
What does it mean? Absolutely nothing.
It's just weather.
Yep, just weather. Okay, so what kind of themes come out of this?
Mrs. A, you did great.
Thanks.
You have 20 minutes
20 minutes?
to have a thematic discussion.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of you.
Well, what kind of themes grow out of this depiction of Henry's battle? Remember at the beginning, we were going to say, we were talking about the fact that Crane was interested in putting men in particular conditions that were difficult, right? And then observing them scientifically to see what they would do. So he's certainly done this in Red Badge of Courage. And if you read his other stories, you'll see he's done it there too. But let's look at this story here. He puts Henry in this situation, in these battles, or successive battles, right, in a war, and observes what he does. What does he do? Well, he runs, then he stands, then what? Then he like kicks back in the sunshine and says, woo, woo, I'm happy because I'm alive, right?
He fights like a
Battle's
wildcat.
behind me, I've forgotten it already. Just exactly like an animal who meets somebody higher on the food chain and runs and gets away and then forgets and goes back to just, dining on the grass tufts around him and enjoying the warm sun on his back, right? Yeah. So a scientific novel. What is he saying? What is a man?
An animal.
An animal. Man's just a complicated animal, a complicated machine. What determines what a man will be? Is there such a thing as individualism? Not really. Just part of a blue demonstration, right? Just a little cog in nature, just a part of nature. Think of the thing, right, in the chapel. What is man? Just a piece of nature, just an animal caught up in the larger machine, okay? If this is a coming of age story, what does Henry learn?
What does it mean to come of age? When are the two? He says it in two places. He says he became aged at one place, and he says he was a man in another place. And those two things, those two lines come at us in similar situations. What does he learn? Realizing your own insignificance.
The pointlessness of your own life, yeah. That the only thing that matters is surviving, maybe. That he's not that important in the greater equation.
But I would say even that the coming of age part is to move on from naivete, the
To
naivete
experience.
of his earlier gospels, right?
Mhm.
To move from naivete to hard experience.
Which is moving away from the heroic stories of old that he fed on in his youth that were full of ideals about what a man is, right? Virtue and courage and significance of the individual in the larger picture and things like that, to having this new concept of what a man is, a cog and a machine and insignificant and just animal, right? Yeah. What a coming of age. Are there other themes that rise to the surface when you reflect?
What about this thing about the idea of courage? I mean, the title, right? The Red Badge of Courage. We would assume that the book is about courage.
In what way? Is he redefining courage? Can courage, as he understood it at the beginning of the book, exist in the real world that the realist Crane is depicting? Good, Abby. There's no such thing as courage. It's just instinct. There's no such thing. Can virtue exist if the world is nothing more than natural? Not really. Not really. And so you see what I mean when I said at the beginning of class that the title, which is linked to that moment when he gets his red badge of courage, which is essentially not a red badge of courage at all. What is it? It's an illusion, right?
It was an illusion when he got
It was an illusion when he got it. He got hit on the head by the butt of a rifle and lied. Right?
Lied.
It was nothing more than a guise, a manipulation of public opinion. Do you see that? Oh, and you can't call it cowardice either, really, Bryn. He makes that he's defending himself against that whole critique when he sees the squirrel and throws the pine cone. The squirrel didn't bare his fangs and fight. He ran because he knew that's how he was going to survive, right? Doesn't matter if nobody knows.
Courage and cowardice are alike on the scale of virtue.
Yeah, and in the story, it's not a dime's worth of difference
Right.
between them, really. It's just about public opinion. Doesn't change anything. And Jim Conklin, in the end, is he a hero? No, he's just dead.
The big death is nothing but the big death.
Right. There's no glory and honor in it. It's just the end. And better for him in the end because he's laying in the sunshine. Well, not literally, I guess there's a rain, but he lived to see the sunshine again, right? It's kind of bleak. Is there anything redemptive in this story at all?
Fatima says, I'm glad I didn't read this again. This is depressing.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. But is there anything in the world in the book that is in any way redemptive? Because Crane's living in this world.
I don't
right?
think redemptive is the right word, but he does suggest that there's something we should focus on.
Hannah says a little bit. What is it? What is it, Hannah? Did you notice anything redemptive in the story at all? Are there any relationships in the story that are redemptive? Are there any characters that find any redemption in the story? Maybe Henry doesn't.
You
Maybe
mentioned
someone else
Wilson.
does. What about Wilson?
You mentioned Wilson and the tattered soldier, frankly.
Yeah, one of you wanted, Hannah, it might have been you that said earlier, I can't remember who said, where did this happen? It might have been Fatima. In the story where the cheery man guides him back to camp, and then he has that whole experience with Wilson, and Wilson's really changed, and he's humbled, and what is his response to the guy that he was, basically trading taunts with at the beginning of the story? When he sees this guy wounded, what does he do? He says, I'll take care of you. And he's kind, and he's gentle, and he's empathetic, right? And why does Crane spend such a long time telling us about Wilson and marking this change in his nature? What is the effect on the changed Wilson on the larger community? Yeah, he's realized his insignificance, and the response for him is what? Kindness, right?
It's
humility, personal humility. Yes, that's true. But really the effect that it has is it motivates him to identify with other people in his condition and to offer to them kindness and help and gentleness and friendship,
compassion,
and
and
right?
empathy.
That this maybe is all that human beings can hope for if reality really is the way that Crane is depicting it.
So there's not any transcendent meaning in life, and in that context, being nice to each other is all we can hope for. That's the highest good. Companionship.
If we look at Wilson,
Compassion.
course, then there's Henry, who says, oh, no, it's just making sure we've got some sort of leverage in there so that we can control our own public opinion polls. You see, this is interesting. The effect of this knowledge of insignificance on the community, right? It's interesting. If we're looking for anything redemptive in here, it's got to be Wilson. Wilson's the only redemptive character in the entire story. And it's the empathy that he shares. Because really, if you paint a landscape like this, if the world really is the way that the realist Crane was depicting it, there's no greater good. I mean, there's nothing eternal. We're talking about universals, but not necessarily eternal things, because there's just nature and death, right? There's just bundles of nerves and cells and acting and reacting to stimuli in the world. There's not anything noble. There's not anything that's good. There's just this rubbing together of other creatures who are in the same predicament. And as we are able to notice that they're in the same lot that we're in, maybe we offer them a kind hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's all that there is. All right. All right, well, what are we going to make of this story? Let's go back to what we know about the realist and the naturalist. And we were talking about him coming on the heels of The Origin of Species, which was all about Darwinism, right? And it painted a world in which DNA, right? The DNA in man decides who and what he is. It's very deterministic. This was followed up psychologically with all kinds of theories like the tabula rasa theory, that when man comes into the world, he's this blank slate and he gets written on by the social forces around him. And it's kind of predetermined by his ancestry, his heredity, and his place in society, what he's going to be, what he's going to do. That there's not a lot of agency in a man, that he's just sort of the victim of his DNA and his circumstances, okay? So here comes Crane, and he imbibes these ideas and wants to portray man's circumstances in print, in fiction, right? And how does he portray him? Well, man is an animal. It's not a separate entity from the rest of creation anymore, different in kind and degree, with some sort of dignity and place at the top of creation, ruling over it, the pinnacle of creation. But instead, he's just this bundle of cells, subject to all of his genetic ancestry and conditioned by his social and economic circumstances, right? So we see that determinism, Crane seemed to see that determinism was at the heart of life. And this replaces idealism. And this idea, these ideas, determinism, Darwinism, that these things replace idealism, right? And now what is he doing? It's affecting the creation of his novels. They're no longer, the novel itself is no longer imaginative, but it's observation and experimentation. Descriptive, right? Like a journalist. They're scientific novels. So, you already see this in this book. In his Maggie Girl of the Streets, the social determinism I'm talking about is pervasive. In his short story, The Open Boat, about the shipwreck, nature is not hostile, but it's completely indifferent. We saw that in Red Badge of Courage. In Red Badge of Courage, life is chaotic. It's fragmented. There's nothing unifying, no unifying order, no larger theme giving it meaning except nihilism, right? But even so, his realism has a kind of personal honesty. It's in that reporting style that he assumes, his tell it like I see it kind of reporting style. He pictures these incomplete characters in this very broken world that's very fragmented and random, right? It's kind of, some critics have referred to the story as impressionistic, a series of impressions, right? Which is the way that we experience life ourselves. There are little interludes, little vignettes, little impressions, and from those we take our understanding of the larger meaning of the thing that we call life. If this is more random than scientific, Why would that be? If we're going to call his story, the series of events, more random than scientific in this scientific novel, why would that be? What might he be trying to say? Yeah, good, Hannah. That's true. It's a good observation. No names are used except in conversation, which adds to the whole insignificance. Yeah. The lack of individuality or personality. Yep, absolutely. Because is personality even really possible? Individuality? Does Darwinism account for personality or for individuality?
Maybe individuality in terms of uniqueness physically, but it doesn't account for the individuality of the soul.
No.
Or even the existence of the soul.
No, it doesn't. So if he is showing something more random than scientific, maybe it's because without some sort of a master behind the scenes ordering events, everything loses its coherence, right? Without some sort of creator behind creation, science itself loses its stability. That is its unifying explanation, right?
The implication of Darwin in 1859 is that the universe is governed, if that's the right word, by chance.
Mm-hmm.
And impersonal nature is the face of chance.
So if humans live in this kind of impersonal random universe, what must they do? Well, band together in empathy.
Make the
of
best
the
they
human
can
experience.
of a bad situation.
Yeah.
To survive, right, Abby?
We got to survive. We got to care for our own. And so community is the only thing that brings meaning to the meaningless human experience in Crane's world, right? Which explains or is borne out in his own life. I mean, he was very interested in social justice issues, right? Very interested in those people that for a time when he was a young man, he went and lived on the streets. And his first novel grew out of his experience on the streets, right? And he was moved by his experience, by the squalor, by the hunger and poverty and abuse that he saw on the streets. But in a world where there are no absolutes, there's no virtue or anything like that, what's left except just human empathy?
So we only have about 2 minutes left, and the questions in the chat box I think are worth addressing as we close here. Why in the world would we assign and read such a depressing book?
Really
Can't we
good.
end on a positive note somehow? What in the world have we done with the last month of our lives and reading this downer? So Mrs. A, address that for just a brief minute before we close today.
I think that's a really important question. And I'm glad that we're going to have a minute to talk about this. Why do we read books that don't necessarily encourage us or that don't reflect our personal worldviews?
Or spur us on to
Or
virtue.
spur us on to some sort of larger virtue, morally speaking? What would be the purpose in reading it? If you think about it, what is literature and what is the literary experience for? What would you say, Mr. A?
Well, there are two things I would think immediately that jump to mind. And one of them is to understand the intellectual history of the period that we're discussing. This is American literature.
Yeah.
One of the most important periods in American intellectual history is the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was, for better or worse, dominated by this kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so to understand yourself as an American with a particular history, intellectually speaking, you have to understand naturalism, realism, and Darwinism in literature. So that's reason number one. But the larger reason that we read literature is so that we can relate to all facets of the human experience. The truth of it is that they didn't stop thinking this way in the late 19th century. These are still ideas that are very current today, that plague people, that trouble people, that are part of the public discourse that makes us Americans and thinking Americans right to this very minute. And so to understand how artists have wrestled with these things is a critical part of living in the world we live in.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very important part. Not only that, but the intellectual history that you mentioned, it doesn't cease to be once we leave that time.
Yeah.
But it's inherited, right?
Right.
All of history and all of art is really a large conversation about the ideas of what it is to be a man in this particular world. The What are the eternal things, if there are such things as eternal things? What is the nature of reality? How do we understand ourselves? How should we live? How should we live ourselves as individuals and in relationship to the community, the one and the many? These are the kinds of questions that men, regardless of their place and time, have addressed. And in art, not just in their rhetorical experience or in terms of theology and things like that, but also artistically, they're addressing these things and depicting them in order to contribute to the conversation about these things. And we can't really understand the kind of culture, because art and culture go hand in hand. We can't understand the culture that we've inherited, right, unless we acknowledge the people that came before us in this conversation, right? And that has a lot to do with understanding our history, right? Otherwise, without an understanding of history, we're just kind of bumping around and running up against things that we don't understand ourselves.
So we recommend this book to you for two reasons. Number one, know your own intellectual history as people interested in the American tradition. And number two, embrace these ideas as a part of contemporary culture so that you can be more equipped to interact with it and know where it is you stand.
Absolutely.
I do have to quit the class now, though, since we are over our time just by a minute, and you guys have to go on to other things. So I'm grateful that you came. Mrs. A, thank you for leading us in a great discussion of this American classic. And we'll put the recording up in Google Classroom along with the discussion post forthwith, and see you guys next time.
All right. Until we meet again, happy reading.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Happy reading.